Hi, everyone. My name is Toby Chan, as was mentioned. Thank you, everyone, for being here and joining with our discussion on SAF, the cost competitiveness and sustainability, past, present, and future. First, let's start back a little bit. So why is SAF important? SAF is the only way to decarbonize immediately, whilst other technologies like hydrogen and electrification will contribute to that. IATA says that by 2050, SAF will account for 65% of the decarbonization efforts in aviation. Right now, there's only 300 million liters of production in 2022, and to meet our net zero goals by 2050, 450 billion liters of production is required. Just think about that. That's more than 1,000 times that's required. Currently, there are 7 approved pathways to produce SAF. Each of them comes with different cost, competitiveness, and sustainability sort of measures. Today, we'll talk about going through each of these, and on that note, I'd like to introduce my panelists, starting with Iris. It will be great for you to sort of take us back how we got here and what do you see are the different pathways and the different sort of measures that you see right
thanks, Toby. So maybe first of all, for the audience, I'm currently head of science at Extantia, based in Berlin, Germany. And my personal background, I'm essentially a chemist that turned into a venture capital investor. So during my academic years, I used to work on a process to make sustainable fuels from carbon dioxide and hydrogen. Now, to answer your question in terms of technology, if we think back, let's say, very far in history, as humanity on this planet, we used to use fuel since, we are actually on this planet. And it started maybe in a very rudimentary way, so using wood and setting wood on fire to keep ourselves warm. But then slowly over time, we started moving to more energy-dense sources. So first we discovered coal, which is denser than wood, obviously, and then eventually we discovered oil, which is the crème de la crème when it comes to energy density. And still to date, nothing can actually compete with these hydrocarbons when it comes to energy density. And that's where SAF comes in. Because it's essentially a drop-in fuel, and from a chemist point of view, a drop-in fuel means that it's essentially the exact same molecule as the hydrocarbons that we have from the fossil-based resources. Now, a lot of these technologies related to SAF have already existed for decades, if not a century. So the question is, why are they taking off now, all these technology pathways, right? And maybe let's look at sort of the oldest example. So Fischer-Tropsch synthesis is one of the pathways to produce synthetic fuels. This was essentially invented already in the 1920s. And actually, 2 German chemists invented this out of necessity. So right before World War II, they needed fuel to power their planes and their other vehicles. But they didn't have access to coal or oil. So they created a technology to make fuels, or synthetic fuels, out of carbon monoxide and hydrogen. And this is still the basis for a lot of technologies that we actually need to produce SAF. And only after that we came up with pathways like HEFA, so producing fuel from cooking oil. And after that we came up with alcohol to jet. So basically creating fuel from alcohols. And so then the question becomes, why are these technologies only taking off now if they have already existed for a century, right? And it essentially all comes down to money. So if we look at Fischer-Tropsch synthesis and its popularity, we can clearly see in history that every time that the oil price went up, the popularity of Fischer-Tropsch synthesis increased. So every time oil became more expensive, we saw more academic papers and more patents on the topic. So money is also something, let's say, that we at Extantia use as a KPI, so key performance indicator, when we scan for SAF technologies. And apart from money, there's obviously energy inputs and CO2 footprint reduction. So I'm quite curious to hear from Nicholas and from Martin, how are you seeing this and how are you tackling these issues?
Well, maybe first introduce myself. My name is Martin Spencer, and I'm Vice President of Business Development at GAF. And we already make some use of the technologies that Iris mentioned. We use carbon dioxide as a feedstock, and ultimately, with an electrolyzer and a fermentation step, end up with these long hydrocarbons that Iris mentioned have this energy density that we currently require. Obviously, yeah, as mentioned, a lot of these technologies are becoming, more prevalent as also the demand and the mandates for them are becoming more extreme because, as we have these Refuel EU initiatives, there's more and more demand for SAF. And yeah, the way we sort of look at it with regards to price is that obviously it's, yeah, as Iris mentioned, extremely important as, it determines which of these technologies are going to become more prevalent in the near future. But there's also a certain amount of necessity that comes with that. And we also believe that, over the next few decades, as companies realize they're really going to need some of this stuff, we'll also see an expansion in the popularity towards that sort of technology. Maybe, Nicholas, you want to talk a bit about what...
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I'm Nicholas. I'm the CEO and co-founder of XFuel. Firstly, our pathway, that we're working on and developing at XFuel is fundamentally different to what is already out there and been approved. So that definitely makes it a little bit harder for us. But
please share what you can.
No, so essentially we work with a chemical and thermal essentially process. And we have a mix of feedstocks. So we focus on solid biomass, lignocellulosic materials. And we also have a recycled carbon element to it as well. So we're able to kind of have a mixed output as well. The interesting thing about, I think, what Iris is mentioning is so true. It all comes down to cost, right? And I think post-pandemic, we saw this, and the OPEC limiting on oil, prices surged. And we're starting to see a huge amount of SAF pathways in production increase because of this. Basically, it now makes sense to produce very expensive SAF, which previously it didn't. Obviously, legislation's helping, and there are other tax credits and things that have come in place. But fundamentally, I think we do need to move towards technologies that can scale, because of course, if we're talking about heifers and things like that, they're limited. There's only so much waste cooking oil available and animal fats. So we do need to look at the Fischer-Tropsch type technologies, which are more able to scale. The issue there is cost. So we're just going to need a lot of support, I think, in the market to be able to do that, and more innovation.
Yeah,
we'll get onto that probably later.
What you mentioned about the availability of feedstock, that's definitely a big factor. And also, in order to produce all these biofuels, the availability of land is also very important. So, we've talked about the cost side of things. What about on the sustainability side? How do these different sort of pathways compare? And is there a necessary trade-off between the cost side and sustainability, or they can work together? Yeah, I would like to sort of go back to Iris, if you can sort of comment on that a little bit.
So that's a good question. I think actually, first of all, the sustainability depends very much on what type of pathway you're using, right? So for the Fischer-Tropsch synthesis, it depends on what kind of feedstock we're using. It can be very gray if we're using a fossil-based feedstock, because you can also feed fossil-based CO2 into the process, right? So the main question is, where do we get the CO2 from? Is it green? Is it from direct air capture, for example, or is it from bio-waste? And the same will apply to a process that uses biomass, for example. Where does the biomass come from? Like, did we use arable land? Is it like an energy crops, or is it like waste? So I'm quite curious, actually, to hear what you think. Like, how sustainable is it, and how limited in terms of geography will it be if you use biomass as a feedstock?
So our calculations on biomass, waste biomass, it's one of the most widely available globally. Of course, it's distributed. There's challenges in that respect. But if you're comparing it to other pathways, it's definitely one of the more kind of interesting ones. The limitation here is similar, again, back to cost. It's, the more sustainable you want to be, the more expensive it's going to be. I mean, based on the pathways we have today, at least. So if you're looking at, essentially an e-fuel type or an e-kerosene type, you're looking at direct air capture or things like that, you can add multiples to the price of the other technologies we've just spoken about, right? So I think it's all a kind of function of that and sustainability. There are some, let's say, intermediate solutions, which I think could hit that price point and sustainability point pretty well. Solid biomass is one of them. I think what's interesting and people don't speak enough about is, municipality solid waste, which is typically what's used in the Fischer-Tropsch because it's got a gate fee. Actually, people pay you to take it away. But what people maybe don't realize is like 40% of that comes from fossil origin, right? It's not actually all biogenic. Now, we call that recycled carbon, and that I think is a useful thing and good thing to do. And the questions are, how long is that going to be a sustainable input?
Yeah, so I think where you're using biomass, for example, as a feedstock, you are using CO2 as a feedstock. So how is that different? Like, how does it compare?
Well, I mean, the straightforward answer towards what's most sustainable, and in terms of the overall reduction in CO2, using CO2 as a feedstock is always going to beat any other feedstock, because of course, all of your carbon is being sourced directly from CO2. So, of course, you know, the advantage in our process is that with regards to being concerned about where you source your biomass from, is the carbon dioxide that you're using truly biogenic? As long as you can assure that it's biogenic carbon dioxide, you will have the best overall CO2 reduction. And it's interesting with regards to price as well. You know, you mentioned that at the moment, having the more sustainable options are also the more expensive. I think that's certainly true today, you know, and you see that in any sort of cost analysis, is that power to liquid certainly is far more expensive than, for example, municipal solid waste, like you mentioned. But I think the legislation will also try to accommodate that, and we're already seeing that even the sub-mandates of e-fuels, for example, will help support those technologies and reward those that are most sustainable. So currently we have the level of 65% of, you know, CO2 emissions in order to count as SAF. So that already gets rid of a lot of these land-based crops that we use, because of course those are actually quite unsustainable. But I think over the next few years we'll also see, with new introductions of reward schemes for SAF production methods, that the more sustainable you are, the more you'll be rewarded for it as well. And so that dynamic will be quite interesting to see over the next few years, is who can have the most sustainable SAF production method and also be still cost competitive, despite the fact that you, in theory, have a higher production cost initially.
Yeah, so essentially, what you're actually saying, we have like 50 shades of green. Like, it can classify as SAF, even though it's not 100% sustainable, let's say. So where are you right now in terms of cost or like footprint reduction?
So we estimate that by using carbon dioxide in our process, the reduction would be between 90 and 100%. But our process in itself does offer a lot of flexibility, because of course limiting yourself to just carbon dioxide is a bit of a disadvantage. So we're also able in our fermentation process to use things like second generation sugars and also glycerol, for example. And so that, those will sort of also have an influence, of course, on overall CO2 reduction, but also at the end output, it will be interesting to see how that influences the price as well. So I think also these technologies being flexible will allow, whilst there's still a bit of wiggle room within legislation, to also find the sort of sweet spot of sustainability and production costs.
Yeah, I think, like, don't forget about, you know, different pathways might have different advantages because of where that particular project is located. You know, where is the most sustainable feedstock that's around that geographical location? I think we talked about that. And I think it's also good that we are making progress in all these pathways, because then that diversifies the SAF that's available in different regions, which I think, you know, it's you know, things that we need to work towards. As we sort of get towards the end of the session, do you guys have a particular view on, we talked about the past, we talked about the present, do you have a winner or in your mind, or how do you see this race between the different pathways play out? I'll start with Nicholas there.
I think, you know, we have to be conscious of how we spend our resources at this stage. Like, we are building our infrastructure to build more. E-fuel is a good example. We're building our infrastructure to you know, essentially produce more renewable energy. We need to make use of that today the best possible way. So I think if there are resources out there that we can use, like solid biomass, that makes sense, we should definitely be doing that. The sustainability criteria of these things, I think, will get better. So, for example, our greenhouse gas savings are estimated. It's under development, and we're working with some great people at the DLR and the University of Sheffield. But we're looking at between 80 and 90% greenhouse gas savings. But we have slight different advantages, which we also do carbon removal, which we can allocate to the fuel, and so potentially have carbon negative fuels. So it's quite an interesting aspect of our technology there. So I think as we go forward in the future, things are going to develop further where we're going to get more efficient, basically. We will see better greenhouse gas savings, basically more sustainability on that side, and lower costs as we go along. And of course, policy, will help, and the immediate need and the urgency of climate change in general is definitely going to be pushing us in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think in general at Extantia, we don't want to bet on the green premium. So any SAF or any product that we look at in the climate tech space and potentially want to invest in, we want it to be able to become cost competitive with the fossil-based alternative without, let's say, needing these subsidies. Like, it's fine if they're there in the beginning and they can really help taking any new technology off the ground, but eventually, let's say in 10, 20 years, we need to become cost competitive with fossil-based alternatives. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. And on that note, looking at the future, I think we will need a whole bunch of different technologies. We'll need to produce a lot of SAF. So there's not going to be one winner, in my opinion. And the technology that you should use depends also strongly on geography, for example. Like in places where we have a lot of renewable energy available that's cheap, we should probably do Fischer-Tropsch synthesis. And in places where we do not have a lot of renewable energy that's cheap, but we have a lot of biomass, we could think of other technologies, such as like alcohol to jet or like HEFA, actually. So I think it will be a mix of things in terms of technologies for the future.
Yeah, I mean, what Iris just said about not having just one winner, that also really resonates with us. I think it's obvious that in any sort of analysis that you look at, there's always a variety of technologies that get thrown into the mix of what's going to be there. Of course, some are going to do better than others, but like we're talking about with different feedstock availabilities, renewable electricity availability, those are all going to be key influences in which technology prevails most. Of course, in terms of winners, I hope we're in there as well, but I'm sure we can hope for that. But yeah, I mean, there's no one winner, and there's going to be a lot of different options. So
yeah, I think it's exciting that yourselves included, and so meeting a lot of other companies that are trying to either sort of improve some of these like pathways or think about ways to solve some of these like smaller problems along some of the processing methods that squeeze out extra efficiencies. And I think over time, yes, we're going to make progress and hopefully bring the cost down, as Ira said, to parity. Do you think that's going to happen in 10, 20 years, or is there any way we could bring that down sooner? Or
yeah, I think there will be technologies even in 2030 that are going to reach price parity with fossil fuels. And that's in the end what it all comes down to, right? Reaching that price parity with fossil fuels. So yeah, we might need subsidies for the coming years because a lot of these SAF technologies are currently more expensive than fossil fuels. But I think it's not unlikely to think that by 2030 there will be some technologies that are cost competitive. And I think, let's say, the blending rate of SAF in current aviation fuels will only increase in the coming years.
Yeah. And you think it's a function of, right now the production's so small, so the scale of production is relatively minor, but as you said, some of these government incentives are put in place. It encourages much larger scale investments. Having bigger production facilities achieve that economies of scale, that would also sort of really help bring the cost down.
I think it's also important to mention, though, that one of the bottlenecks within the SAF industry is that we're also very dependent on the evolution of other technologies, right? So, for example, when we're talking about sourcing carbon dioxide in a sustainable fashion, those technologies are not at the point to which we could rely on them to be scalable, like you're talking about with regards to scalability. So, another example is renewable electricity. We haven't really figured that out. And I mean, I'm from the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, renewable electricity is not available 24/7 at a competitive rate. So those are also there are other technologies that are going to have an influence ultimately on, which SAF production methods are going to be more competitive in the end.
I also think it's slightly like a moving target. We were talking about price parity with fossil. I mean, volatility in the fossil market is rampant, right, in the last year or two. It's very hard to build projects out for like innovators, like startups like ourselves, when the target's always moving, and there isn't really too much support, both on a technical level and on a financial level. So I think that definitely is a major hurdle in the market, is being able to support kind of new pathways and actually production facilities out there.
Yeah. So what you were getting at was maybe like economies of scale, right? So if you scale up, you can reduce the overall capex, and that then decreases the cost.
Yep.
But I think for a lot of startups, like the two of you, to start off that way is kind of impossible.
Oh, yeah.
I think most startups that we see in the SAF space are using a modular approach, so they can scale up a lot faster. So what do you think, like on economies of scale? Like, is this helping you already, or is it going to help you in the next decade?
So we also do modular approach,
Yeah.
obviously, for that reason. So our smallest kind of projects are very small for the industry, and that has its own hurdles because, of course, you have to find an off-taker that's willing to take a very small amount, and that's not always so easy. But I think, yeah, that is definitely a hurdle. But I do think, obviously, as we scale, things get better. You do get operational efficiencies, you bring down the price, definitely, and you can also be more aggressive in contracts and such, right? So you can be more aggressive on how much feedstock you supply, how much you're selling your fuel at. All these things come into play as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I think naturally also your process becomes more attractive to investors and people as soon as you can also prove that it's scalable, right? So, of course, at the moment, yeah, every startup is struggling to also produce the amount necessary to really test the fuel as well, which is another important factor. And of course, when looking at the future and the potential of the technology, there is a certain amount that you have to do with regards to predicting what it would look like in a more scaled fashion, right? Because of course, in a small scale, the efficiencies are nowhere near what you require to be cost competitive if we're talking about, kerosene parity. But yeah, the scalability is definitely an important factor. It's something that a lot of startups will have to really try and do their best to prove that it's possible, because of course it's very difficult to prove something that you don't have yet. And when you need to convince someone to help you reach that scalability, then yeah, that's a difficult task.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for your comments. But I think like the good thing is that the demand signals are certainly there. Last year when I went to the Aviation Carbon Conference, it's because of that sort of demand signals that triggered a lot of activity. And I think we're looking forward to the future on how these different pathways were developed, and wish our panelists here every success in their own journey to lower the cost and increase the sustainability of their pathways. And ours, I'm sure, will definitely discuss more on this topic as the sector develops. Thank you everyone for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.